So here's the way I understand the phenomenon. You have a guy who comes along, plays the role of a god. I mean, he institutes a new way of, a new understanding of what it is to be anything at all. That's Jesus. There's some sense in which I think, when I read the text, it looks like he's living this new way of life, and he understands what it demands of him, but he's not that good at explaining what it is. I mean, he has to talk in parables. He has to, he can, and he's not there to explain what it is. He's there to live it, to be it. That's the better way to say it. He's there to be it. And when he is it, others get to be it too, because they get caught up in this mood that he manifests, and they become part of the community, and they get to be it. I'm interested in this idea of apostolic succession. You really have to be there to get caught up in a mood. That seems right to me. I mean, someone tells you about the mood of the party last Friday night. Just hearing about it doesn't put you in the mood. You got to be there, right? You really have to be there. And so I think that I can understand that, and I can understand that it would take someone afterwards to come along and say, now here's sort of what it's about. Let me try to explain to you what the basic ideas are. And it's not as if I think that Paul told a systematic and rational story about that. I don't think there is a systematic and rational story about that. As I say, I think that's one of the interesting things about it. But I do think that he helps us to understand, for instance, in terms of the example that I was giving before, he helps us to understand what it would be to understand the life of Jesus as a life that's organized around this notion of agape, organized around this notion of love. That's something that sort of inspires you. You get infused with it, and you see the world anew through it. I think of that as, among other things, one of the things that we get from Paul's sort of characterization of what Jesus' life is about, that we wouldn't necessarily get without Paul. I mean, we need his help to be able to focus on it that way. I think that's the way. I mean, there aren't very many phenomena like this, but if there were, I think that's the way they would work. Someone lives the phenomenon, and he is the thing, and as a result, he's not all that good at saying what it is to be the thing. He just is it and brings other people into it. It takes someone else to come along and say, okay, here's a way that we could understand what was going on there. And that's sort of the way I understand the relation between them.
Yeah, good. But can I just ask you, Paul's not the only one doing that. Although Paul, in the end, I think it would be fair to say won. You may disagree, right? But, I mean, it's almost a cliche in some circles that Paul is the founder of this movement more than Jesus, and you can obviously agree, disagree, because it seems to me there are arguments all over the place on that. But what is it about Paul that in many ways, certainly for Protestants, but even beyond that his vision seems so powerful relative to the others, and again, I would argue anyway, ultimately prevails to the extent that any one way of reading this could be said to prevail.
Yeah, it's hard to know, as with other things, where to start, and we are covering huge topics tonight, obviously. But I resonate very much with what Professor Kelly said. Only, if I can just nuance that a bit, and then come in from there to your question. Yes, Jesus' vision of God being king on earth as in heaven. That is absolutely central. And people used to sneer and say, well, Jesus talked about God, but the church then talked about Jesus, as though that was sort of falsification. But what they forget is that Jesus talked about God in order to explain the things he was doing, why he was healing on the Sabbath, why he was having fellowship with tax collectors and prostitutes and so on. He was telling God stories in order to explain his own actions, which is a kind of scary thing to do. And yes, the parables, and I don't think the parables are a sort of faute demure. I can't explain it, so I have to tell stories. It seems to me stories are a primary form of human discourse and not a sort of decorated oddity around the edge. And Jesus told those stories because he was saying that for which you have longed is in fact happening, but it doesn't look like you thought it would. And the only way to say that is to tell stories. I found myself in my own ministry sometimes trying to explain things to puzzled people being driven to invent my own parables as this is the only way we're ever going to get anywhere near this. So I don't think it's because he couldn't explain it. However, I like the idea of there being two different moments, because people have often said, well, Jesus and Paul, they're so different. Jesus talks about the kingdom of God and the Son of Man. Paul hardly mentions the first and never mentions the second. Paul talks about the righteousness of God and justification, and Jesus only mentions that once. So are they actually in agreement? Is Paul a faithful follower of Jesus, or has he muddled the thing up? The illustrations I've used, I mean, I like yours, but the illustrations that I've tended to use are Jesus is like the composer who writes the stunning symphony, and Paul is the conductor who gets the orchestra to play it. And if the conductor started to rewrite the symphony, that's not being loyal to the composer, that's being disloyal. So there are different tasks, but within what you said, there is this idea that Christianity is not about the teaching of an abstract theory or an ethic. It's about the living God doing something which changes everything. And that's the kingdom of God message, and that's why it's so difficult for people in the Western world to grasp, because we have a narrative which says that world history came to its climax in the 18th century with the Enlightenment, and now, people say it on the radio in my country all the time, now that we live in the modern world, ... as though we're all signed up to the idea that the great climax of world history was with basically Voltaire, Rousseau, and, forgive me, Thomas Jefferson. And so, we've then got... and the getting rid of George III. Let's just, yeah, okay. That helped, yeah, absolutely. Which is why Americans find it difficult to talk about the kingdom of God. People say to me, oh, we don't have kings in this country, it's easy for you. And I say, actually, your president's much more like an ancient king than our monarchs are, but that's a different story. Sorry, that's just a polemical aside. So that for Paul, but the other big difference for Paul is that, as far as we know, Jesus more or less never, except on very select occasions, addressed non-Jews. He didn't leave the Middle East. He didn't go wandering around. I know there are legends about him going to India or England, but they're much later, silly legends. But Paul believes that it is his vocation to go and do a very particular task. Now, the question, did he win? I mean, actually, we just don't know about Eastern Christianity or Southern Christianity. Paul didn't go into ancient Persia, India, etc. But Christianity got there quite quickly, and it wasn't Paul who took it there. Paul didn't go, as far as we know, into Egypt and point south, but Christianity got into southern Egypt quite early. So what we have in Paul's letters and Acts is a different story, which is a very interesting one, because it's of Paul following the main routes through the Roman Empire. And it's as though both Paul himself, in his plans to go to Spain, which is the furthest western outpost of the Roman Empire, and Luke in writing Acts, telling that story, they are telling what is covertly and sometimes overtly a counter-imperial narrative. And people, particularly in the world of postmodernity, get very twitchy about that, because they say all you're doing is replacing Caesar with Jesus. And I want to say, well, Paul sort of is, but the way he does that is entirely under the rubric of the redefinition of power through the cross. So this is not Caesar-type power. These are communities that suffer, that pray, that do good. Yes, agape is there all the way through. And when you read my book, Not If But When, you'll see that in those, you see that in the last few chapters, when I'm talking about how Paul impacts on the worlds of philosophy, religion, politics, and yes, the Jewish world as well, agape is the strand which we come back to again. But it's not as, here's a nice moral principle. It's actually, this is something that we've discovered to be a human reality in Jesus, and especially his death. And by the way, in case you don't know, agape is a Greek word which meant love in general. It was a much broader word before, but the early Christians shape and sharpen it so that it's specifically a love which gives itself unstintingly and without seeking a return or reward. And that is the love which, according to the New Testament, the God who made the world has for all of us, and the love which then sent Jesus to die on the cross, and the love which Paul says can be ours as well, both to experience and then to pass on.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.